Hey folks, it's Jim Martin. Today I want to talk about Israel and give you a primer on Israel writ large. Here we go. So Israel as a country did not exist until 1947. The area that we know as Israel has existed in sort of a nebulous form for a long time. Jews have lived there for centuries. However, modern Israel was really part of the Ottoman Empire. And this is more recent history, let's say. When it was part of the Ottoman Empire, and I'm talking pre-1900s, really the whole area was kind of a backwater because there wasn't any kind of real resources there or anything like that. The population was extremely small. When the first people were able to actually go there and photograph the city, it was just a ruin mostly. I mean, people lived there, but not very many. And the whole place was kind of just broken down, fallen apart, abandoned buildings and torn up streets and all of this sort of thing. Sometime in the 1800s, you begin to see folks that had previously left that area begin to immigrate back. And these started in like the 1880s. There's a number of reasons why. Most Jews at that time lived in Europe. They weren't popular there because they were an ethnic and religious minority. So in many countries, Austro-Hungarian Empire, France, Germany, etc., there were pogroms against Jews at particular times. And what is a pogrom? It's basically when a huge crowd of the dominant group decides that they're going to roll into the Jewish neighborhoods, burn everything they can, beat people up, kill some people, this sort of thing. And this happened a lot in that sort of time frame, 1800s into the 19th century. A lot in Russia also. People began to say, we know this isn't the greatest place to be, and we should return to our ancestral homeland instead. And so you begin to see waves of immigration into the area that is now known as Israel. At that time, I think it was called Palestine, but I'm not completely sure. Still part of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were like, whatever, we don't have time to deal with that. As long as you pay taxes, you're fine. So these amounts were small at first, 5,000, 10,000 a year, something like that. And there would be kind of waves of it. I believe one of the first ones was in the 1880s. Every about 10 or 12 years, you'd see another influx of people. And then when we get to World War I, the Ottoman Empire is basically destroyed. Or almost at the end of World War I, the British, who had some sort of nominal territorial mandate from the League of Nations and others, declared that there was support from the British government for a Jewish homeland in that area. That encouraged more immigration. And this just continued through the 30s. Then we have World War II, which is obviously a defining moment. You can't emphasize enough the impact of the Holocaust on Israel and Jews of all sorts all over the world. That horrific tragedy led to a tremendous upspike into that area. What began to occur once that happened is conflict primarily with the British, but with also their neighbors looking on, Jordan, Syria, etc., looking on with some concern about this. And the people that came in there began to establish farming communities and towns and all sorts of things, really with minimal resources at all, extremely innovative types of approaches. But they began to fight against the British and really utilize guerrilla tactics and even terrorism to fight against the British. The British Empire at that time, we're talking, this is 1945 to 1947, is like, you know what, we don't have the resources to manage this stuff anymore. They were stepping away from empire, and that was something that they just could not afford to keep up with. The leaders of the guerrilla movement that had been fighting against the British declared an independent state for Jews and called it Israel. From that time on, there have been numerous wars between Israel and its neighbors. In many cases, especially in those early years, there was very little support for Israel from outside. So they were, by hook and by crook, kind of getting things, weapons, creating business opportunities, doing all these kinds of things. But they did it, and they managed to fight off all of their neighbors at one time or another. So some of the biggest ones that really kind of shaped the territory of what we call Israel now are the Six-Day War in 1967 and then the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And I'm not going to go into great detail, but basically every country around them attacked them at the same time in both of those circumstances. They came out of those victorious and also managed to gain territories, including East Jerusalem and what we call the West Bank and large swaths of what was Egypt, including the Gaza Strip. They also took significant territory in the north away from Syria. These victories created a lot of resentment amongst those powers who took advantage of the Palestinians that were living in Israel's conflict with the fundamental idea of the Israeli state and began to supply them with weapons and training and things like this. And the Soviet Union supported some of these too during this time. So you have this underlying unrest and also guerrilla movements, terrorism happening kind of all the time during this period of time. The allies of Israel were kind of a shifting cast of characters. Sometimes the United States would support Israel, sometimes France would, sometimes the United Kingdom would, but it was never like lockstep. You also have a lot of international terrorism happening at the time. Again, somewhat supported by the Soviets with intelligence and resources and training. People like the Red Army faction and the Baader-Meinhof gang with events like Munich, where PLO, Red Army faction, cooperation, collaboration, whatever you want to say. And these things were huge national news. You also begin to see hijackings and things like that as a form of terrorism. So Israel has always been in a position, and its leaders, to always expect this sort of thing to happen. And with that kind of cultural memory of the Holocaust, their policies have been largely oriented towards immediate crushing response or surreptitious reprisals for things. I mean, the folks who perpetrated Munich were hunted down by the Israeli intelligence services and killed. As one example, there are many. When you get into the 80s, you have a period of greater unrest called the Intifada, a lot of protests and violence. The state managed, Israel and its security forces managed to largely keep that in check, but it also led to ultimately a peace agreement between the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was led by Yasser Arafat, and the Israeli government. That was brokered in part by Bill Clinton. For some time, there was a lot less violence in Israel as a result of that. The fall of the Soviet Union didn't hurt anything because the support and funding and weapons and training began to dry up for many of these groups. Let's talk about the politics of Israel a little bit. I mean, first, it's confusing. But they're a democracy. They have a parliamentary form of government. Because of the various interests in Israel and the various ethnicities and all sorts of different things, there are a lot of parties in Israel and kind of a changing cast of characters leading various parties too. So the end result of that is that it's every government in Israel has been a coalition government, which means that there are several parties represented in that government. Netanyahu emerged on the scene in the 90s and really became a quite masterful communicator and a masterful manipulator of transactional politics. So, hey, here's a party that is generally not in alignment with my party's interests, but let's work it out. And what do you want? And so by providing things like, hey, you can have this ministry and the resources associated with it, which you will use to benefit your community mostly, these kinds of things were worked out so that continually he would be sort of the only option for the prime ministerial post. Really, really good at this. But it also creates this sort of logjam where really nothing fundamental can get done. It's important to note that Israel does not have a constitution. They are governed by the basic law, which is a set of sort of abstract principles that govern the nature of the Israeli democracy and state. It's very difficult to make things at a fundamental level. It's pretty amazing that they were able to come to a peace agreement with the PLO back in the 90s when they did. He's been in power more or less since, 9/11. And, occasional times where things have gotten upset and he had to share power or was out for a little bit, but mostly he's been there. Now, when you engage in transactional politics, you generally end up with some pretty interesting bedfellows, and you also have a high likelihood of having participated in some corrupt activities. And that is the case. He was charged with corruption and some other things, and then has spent about the last 4 or 5 years kind of fending off that by making these arguments that he is not subject to that unless he is not prime minister. He's remained prime minister. These small, very conservative parties to kind of fend off all the challengers that came his way. A word about them. So there are in the attitude of most Israelis that I have met is really something that Americans don't understand. They're very liberal in terms of social policies. However, at the same time, they are extremely nationalistic. Another thing that's interesting that would surprise a lot of people, I think, is that for many, many years, Israel promoted emigration into Israel at a level that would shock most people. Their idea was we need to allow, should they wish, anyone who is Jewish to emigrate and live in Israel. And so you had extensive negotiations with the Soviet Union in the 70s over allowing Jews, who were, again, a repressed minority and often seen as a potential threat to the Soviet state, to emigrate to Israel. You also had mass rescue efforts in Africa to bring Sephardic Jews from places like Sudan and Somalia and different places like this. A lot of ethnic diversity in Israel as well. The Ashkenazi Jews that came out of Eastern Europe and Russia during this period of time have a different set of political views that generally involve a much more conservative and autocratic sort of state. Does Netanyahu share that? Probably not at his heart, but in order to make deals that allow him to stay in power, he's played along with them, and they have forced his hand in many situations, move towards a more authoritarian sort of approach to things. And they would prefer that. They tend to be, not all, but they tend to be advocates for basically taking over the West Bank again, driving out the Palestinians to wherever they might end up. Notably, they were also quite opposed to the deal that Netanyahu made when he abandoned the Gaza Strip and turned it over to the Palestinian Liberation Organization at the time. This was in 2004, 2005, and have been pining to get it back ever since. Democracy is a means to an end for many of those folks, and it's a difficult chess game in terms of politics. Netanyahu is deeply unpopular with about 80% of the population. I don't know anyone that likes him or that supports him. And many of the people that I know there are deeply concerned with what's happening in Gaza right now. And they protest on a regular basis. I mean, there have been huge anti-government protests in Israel for about 2 years. This is prior to October 7th. But it's very difficult for the opposition to unify against him in a political sense to get power and make things happen. Most Israelis see him as complicit in October 7th by his negligence of the security forces and ultimately going all the way back to the withdrawal from Gaza. The problem is that elections are not going to happen for a couple of years. So he's going to be in the driver's seat until said time where new elections happen. I fully expect him to be soundly defeated at that time. For now, Netanyahu remains prime minister and will be for the foreseeable future. If this kind of content is interesting to you, please consider hitting the like button, and comments are welcome. Keep them clean. This is an incredibly complex and vitriolic topic in many ways. If you're of a mind, please subscribe to the channel so you get my latest updates. Have a great day, and thanks for stopping by.